Do we have a next speaker? Now our next speaker is Öykü. Yes, we have Öykü. Hi.
Hi, Öykü.
So nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
We see perfectly.
Great,
You're perfectly
thank you.
visible. Let me say a few words about you. Öykü is a second speaker from IMD Business School today after Professor Mieszek Piskorski, who we already admire. Öykü is a digital technology expert, professor of technology management and strategy at IMD Business School. Digital resilience is one of particular focus for Öykü. She's passionate about studying the way disruptive technologies challenge our society and organizations, and how this tension can be fostered for responsible innovation. Two of Öykü's areas of expertise, cybersecurity and digital ethics, are already challenging areas for executives and organizations. Working with companies such as Mastercard, KBC and BNP Paribas Fortis, who is a partner of us, of our conference, Öykü has helped organizations to understand customer expectations better and strategically shape their privacy and data processing related communication. Öykü's research has focused heavily on digital resilience, a combination of the areas of data privacy, cybersecurity, and digital ethics. Her published work encompasses the topics of business intelligence and analytics, technology management, and business process management. So Öykü will be talking to us about cybersecurity and COVID-19, very important topics, and insights from Chief Information Security Officers and their best practice. So the virtual floor is yours, Öykü.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and the invitation. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. And indeed, I want to start with talking a little bit about cybersecurity, the threat landscape, and also share my insights regarding specifically the impact of COVID-19. So let me start by sharing my screen with you. So I wonder how many of our listeners today have received such an email over the past few weeks, seemingly coming from UNICEF, right? Or this one, seemingly coming from a mask manufacturer and distributor selling masks that are, virus-free and protective masks. But actually, one thing in common these mails have is this malicious attachments that we call malware that had the intention of infecting the receiver's computers, maybe to steal their password, to steal their credit card information, etc. It seems that hackers seem to have plans to take advantage of our very emotional weak spots, right? And I'm sure many of you have heard about the news that surrounded Twitter hack. And the culprits were later on caught, and it seems the mastermind of this attack was actually a 17-year-old with two other 20-year-old accomplices that by using social engineering skills, which means literally tricking people into sharing valid system credentials, usernames and passwords, so that they could have access to internal Twitter employee systems, so that within the Twitter, they could manipulate other high-profile Twitter accounts for a Bitcoin scam. It seems like these things are becoming more and more accessible as the skill levels are increasing too. And another example is that I'm sure many of you have heard is the Garmin hack. Right. So Garmin, an organization that is very active in the digital landscape that creates software applications where you would expect digital maturity to be very high, has recently been hacked by a ransomware. And as the humor says, they paid $10 million to get decryption key back. Because as some of you may know, ransomware is an example of a malware that actually encrypts and locks all your systems, and the hackers demand a ransom if you want to get the decryption key back. And finally, just in the last 2 weeks, right? Just only in September, several of these headlines hit the news. Equinix, a data center giant cloud service provider, University of Newcastle, also all hacked by ransomware, in this case leaking personal student data, and also Pakistan's largest electricity power utility provider, affecting millions of people, all impacted by ransomware. It seems like especially this type of cyber threat requires our attention. So it is not going to come as a surprise to you to see that in the last few years, World Economic Forum has been talking about cyber attacks as high likelihood and high impact global risks, following right behind natural disasters like climate change. So definitely deserving more and more of our attention, not only the attention of IT professionals, but also the attention of business executives. Another reason for our business executives to pay attention is, of course, the digital transformation that is occupying the agendas of so many organizations today. And it seems from the recent research and surveys that there's some tensions there, talking about where do we invest our budget? Do we invest in new technologies and innovation, where we heard wonderful new great examples since this morning in this conference? Or do we pay attention and separate our budget for securing our already existing systems and infrastructure? The answer to this question clearly depends on any organization's risk appetite, right? But the most important here is, I think, to understand the fact that digital transformation and cybersecurity by nature are intertwined. It's not possible to think and work on one without considering the other. And as one keeps evolving, so will the other as well. And what is even more critical is to come to the realization that it all comes down to the end user. Your threats, your digital transformation initiatives all have the employee, the user experience, as well as the customer experience in their heart, right? But regardless of all the technological solutions you may have, that you may prepare, like your firewalls, your antivirus software, and etc., at the end of the day, you may still have, as the cartoon goes, a Dave in an organization that may end up clicking that attachment in that email that seemingly is coming from UNICEF, right? So the end user point becomes very, very important, especially during these days where we feel a bit more isolated, where we're working from home. We don't have our IT colleagues right next to us that we can turn to for help. So this becomes even more critical, I think, during this COVID-19 pandemic time. So let's take a look at what can go wrong, right? I want to very briefly introduce the cyber threat landscape. When we talk about this, we talk about three core elements. We talk about threat types, right? What is happening out there? And I've listed only a few examples here on this slide. Malware, such as the ransomware, is a good example of that. Phishing emails, like the UNICEF email that I shared, or social engineering, like in the case of Twitter, calling employees and trying to trick them into revealing confidential data about the organization. But I think we also have to recognize clearly the more advanced, more technical threats out there, such as exploitation of system flaws or vulnerabilities. We also have the risk of physical intrusion, especially in high education environments like universities and business schools, where we have the open door policy. This becomes maybe even more interesting to think about. Then we have denial of service attacks that make certain websites or services unavailable to users. So we have so many different things of threat types. But at the end of the day, majority of them are coming from a couple of threat actors that are really behind these attacks. Hacktivist groups, they are not necessarily doing these things for financial gain, but maybe they are trying to push a political agenda. We have also nation states pushing for a political agenda. But of course, it could also be organized crime, hackers with business plans, right? And also malicious insiders or disgruntled employees that are trying to make harm to an organization. And at the end of the day, they are typically behind a couple of core assets of your organization. Clearly financial gain, money, or customer data that they go ahead and sell on dark web. It could also be intellectual property that will bring them financial gain. And finally, it could also be all about simply harming the reputation, the brand name, and the service availability of an organization. So this is what we would summarize as the cyber threat landscape. So when the COVID-19 crisis hit, we started seeing some of these concepts shifting a little bit. For instance, even World Health Organization started talking about cyber attacks and warning the public, saying that five-fold increase in cyber attacks. We did indeed see a surge in the phishing emails that I shared earlier. So this made me reach out to my network of chief information security officers to see what has changed for you. What has your job changed at all? What is the impact of COVID-19 on the business of cybersecurity? I asked about their Zoom policies, I asked about the remote work challenges, and I asked about these increased attacks. So I will basically summarize a couple of these findings that strike me from these interviews. And the first one is the confirmation of what World Health Organization was also announcing about. Every one of these individuals, and by the way, these individuals were from various different industries, with organizations that has global representation, with different sizes of organizations as well, including manufacturing organizations, pharmaceuticals, financial services, as well as professional consultancies as well. So there was a wide representation of different industries, yet I still ended up hearing a couple of common things, one of them being the attack vectors shifting. So they all corroborated the fact that indeed there was a significant increase in the number of phishing emails they received. Some of these emails were spear phishing examples, which means targeted to attack one organization rather than casting a wide net and see who they can catch. It was also in the form of vishing and smishing, and these are the same things, but rather instead of using email as a medium, they use calls or SMS messages to trick end users. But one interesting point they made about this was the fact that, yes, we did see an increase, especially in the first couple of weeks of the lockdown, but that was not a major concern for us. Now, I have to admit that all these individuals are from organizations that already were doing a good job in cybersecurity. So we can take this learning as rather best practices, and this is something we have to take into consideration. So while doing a good job in cybersecurity already means that you have the means, you have the capacity and mechanism to deal with these phishing emails, this was still a source of stress for these individuals, right? But they said at the end of the day, it lasted only for quite a while, for a short amount of time. Then after that, it was business as usual. That is really not a high risk for us, considering how COVID-19 impacts our cybersecurity in general. So when I questioned about then what is higher priority for you, one of the things they mentioned was these changing security priorities. Probably all of us, part of this conference, had to become a remote work force, right? We were digital employees connecting our critical business applications via our connections, storing our data online, and etc. We did see a surge in the demand for digital applications as well as data storage needs. But this also means for the cybersecurity teams in the organizations, keeping these endpoints, which are us, users, employees, and also these communications safe so that we can do our business safe online. And working from home means having less control for our IT teams over our end user security and secure connections. And some employees also wanted to use maybe their home devices. I remember in one of my interviews listening to the story of a plant manager who did not have to use a laptop before because he always went to the plant and he was using the computers that are operating next to these factory machines. And suddenly he finds himself confined at home, but he needs to access his email, he needs to access his network and certain business applications. So he uses the only laptop that is available in his house, his teenager son's gaming laptop. So you can imagine all the possible viruses and infections that are there on that laptop. Thankfully, they were able to contain before it reached to a great harm for the organization. Only part of the network was impacted, but they were able to confide and take care of this. But I'm sure there are so many other similar stories out there. The learning from is that our home Wi-Fi networks are not as secure as our organizational setup. So one interesting quote from one of the CISOs that I talked to from a financial services company was telling me that, we had these controls before, but they were rather blunt. For instance, we said, no printing from home, that's it. You're going to come back to the office anyhow, your print can wait. But now he said, we realized that we have to relax these measures a little bit, and we had to have more finer allowances so that we could ask about what is it that you want to print, how many copies do you want, how often are you going to print it, so that we can have much more detailed, more precise security controls in place. And the other thing that I've heard from these IT executives repeatedly, as if they agreed on saying this, was pressing third-party as well as cloud vendor security challenges. We did see a surge in cloud demand. Now, cloudification has already been happening for a while now. It was already on an upward trend, but I think with remote work becoming the norm, we in our organization started needing more of this capability in higher capacities. That requires many organizations to stop in their track and think, okay, our IT security can do so much. We can secure our own perimeter, but how about our suppliers? If you think of your cloud service provider or your other third parties as parts of your extended enterprise, they also become endpoints for you. So you also need to take into consideration how secure they are, because they may pose a risk of entry point for your organization. One of the good examples that I heard that was really impressive to me was the CISO of a telco infrastructure provider telling me that their red team, and red teams in organizations are teams that are responsible from offensive strategy. So they are the ones who try to break things so that they find vulnerabilities. One of the red teams in this telco infrastructure provider was extending their capabilities into looking into their vendors and their cloud service providers. And this team found a zero-day vulnerability, which means a vulnerability that nobody knew existed before, for the first time. This shows a great, in a nice way, the great extent that this team went to in order to ensure that not only their infrastructure is secure, but also the infrastructure of the vendor that they are working with. This has become a more interesting point of discussion now, more than ever. What you see also on my slide is something from Amazon Web Services, the leading cloud service provider out there, that talks about the division of responsibilities. I think we see now more and more that this becomes a core discussion point when you start engaging with a cloud service provider for any kind of services, that you also think about these things. What is the role of cloud service provider? Is it that they secure, and where do their turf ends and where do mine start, and what are my responsibilities in terms of keeping the data and the applications on the cloud secure? It seems that this is going to take more time on the agendas, and it's going to be a topic of discussion even before that contract is signed with the cloud service providers. One other thing that I repeatedly kept hearing was the critical role of top management. All of these organizations said we were already on a steady track in making this a board agenda, discussing cybersecurity topics with our board members. They said, but it's clearly this pandemic has accelerated those discussions. As we talked earlier, digital transformation had already brought this up as a topic in the board discussions, but that also made many of these executives realize that cybersecurity is not only an IT issue anymore. Very interestingly, a couple of these executives talked about risk versus compliance-driven cybersecurity. They say if you are doing cybersecurity to comply with a global standard like ISO or GDPR is something that really pushes you to develop this, great, but it will only motivate you to do the bare minimum to be in compliance with these standards. But if you take a much more risk-driven approach, that will push you to first decide on the priorities for your organization and make your investment choices accordingly. And that will be a much more long-term strategic way of looking at cybersecurity. And when it comes to selling this topic to the board, rather than using it as a stick and as something that we need to think about because it's scary, because it's the necessary evil in a digital world, positioning it rather as a business enabler to gain further consumer trust and increase reputation through better security, through better privacy and digital ethics could be a much more sustainable and better way in terms of making this topic take place in, again, board discussions. One of the directors that I talked to in a pharma company talked about how this culture of cybersecurity needs time to change when it comes to being discussed among executives. He was almost feeling bad while saying that, actually this pandemic kind of helped us. This culture was already evolving, but this definitely with remote work and doing pharma work in a digital environment pushed our executives to pay more attention to cybersecurity. He said, you know how they say, never waste a good crisis. And he even suggested that because of this, most of the budget discussions were much more accelerated because they recognized the need to it even more. So if you ask me, okay, what are some clear points that we can take away from all these discussions? I think these four were very, very adamant in all of my discussions. Number one is the message was assume breach. You may have heard the saying that now it's not a matter of if, but a matter of when an organization will get breached. Now, there's another version. We say there are two kinds of organizations, the ones that they know that they have been breached and the ones that do not know that they have been breached. So I think this assume breach concept gives the same message, right? We do need to assume that if it hasn't even happened yet, it will definitely happen soon. And organizations need to get their cybersecurity management processes in order to be able to ready for this and go for a layered defense in a matter of not putting your all eggs in the same basket. And number one priority is to get your priorities right. This is in alignment with the risk-based approach towards cybersecurity. Risk-driven approach rather than compliance-driven approach, as we already said, is a much more sustainable way of taking care of these challenges. And several of these interviewees talked about business continuity planning. Now, if you're a digital native organization, or if you're an organization active in the digital field, maybe cybersecurity is already, by the nature of your business, part of your business continuity plan. But I came to the realization that this is not the case for many more traditional or manufacturing organizations that are not necessarily built on digital business models. And it seems that there's still this distinction between business continuity planning discussions and cybersecurity discussions. But my hope is that we will see more and more converging as digital transformation becomes more prevalent. Now, if you're talking about digitizing your processes, your assets, if you are talking about digital transformation, that means digital becomes a new norm for your business, and hence cybersecurity must be part of your business continuity discussions. And relating to that, your investments on cybersecurity should not be only about keeping the threats out, preventing what is happening, or detecting if something is going on. Next to the prevention and detection cybersecurity processes, cyber incident handling processes is as critical and important as well. We also see in some recent studies showing that this is the most under-invested area when it comes to cybersecurity investments. So organizations really need to hone in on their incident management capabilities and think, Now all my employees are remote. Have I really tested my incident handling plan in a remote setting? How quickly can I isolate and segregate the affected areas if I am faced with a cyber threat? And do I need to call a forensic team? If so, how will I collaborate them in this new normal where we are all connected digitally? Now, I don't want to be the bearer of the bad news, right? I want to look for the good insights in this and say, is there something positive about this? What is a good thing that we can take away from this discussion? And I've heard a couple of these things. One, not all, but some of these executives said that we really do have now a much quicker approval and less difficult budget discussions when it comes to investing in cybersecurity. They say, there's a clear difference. In the old world, it used to be like, here is your budget, keep us out of trouble, build us high walls around our organization so that nobody can come in. But now in the new world, it seems like we have much more educated, engaged executives who are not necessarily cybersecurity experts, but can ask really good questions and challenge cybersecurity executives, which is only going to get things to an even higher standard in organizations. And of course, we were forced to, but most of us did manage to have now a very well-established remote work capability. And when you look around, you see that we do still have some room to cover, though. A recent global survey looked into how the topics of cybersecurity, data protection, take their place in boardroom discussions. And you see that only about 1/3 of the organizations that took place in this study said that their board members are directly involved in the security and privacy risk discussions. That's a really low number. And also only about 39% of them are confident about their organization's capability to keep their sensitive digital assets secure. So even these very rough numbers tell us that we still have quite an improvement, quite a room to cover. And finally, I want to leave you with some food for thought. I'm just going to throw a new terminology out there for those of you who may not have heard this before, and it's called security by design. Or you may even maybe heard privacy by design, which as a concept became very popular with GDPR coming into force in Europe, even though privacy by design is not necessarily a new concept. GDPR was built on this concept, and hence now most organizations are working on implementing this. And it's actually conceptually quite simple. All it says is that please don't create a digital product, a digital service, without thinking of its security, privacy, and even digital ethics implications. Unfortunately, what we most often see is that we have these great tools out there, yet their privacy implications have not been thought out before, so they end up being the subject of a privacy breach, for instance, or a cybersecurity breach. And then what happens is that knee-jerk reaction, they go back and they patch it up and they fix it. Security by design and privacy by design advises organizations that don't do it as such. Make sure that you involve privacy and security from the innovation phase, from the design and innovation phase, so that you have these things covered as you are producing or manufacturing your new services and products and processes. The idea is that both privacy and cybersecurity become integral to an organization's priorities, project objectives, design processes, and planning operations. And that way, this becomes a natural thought for organizations. And by doing that, we will definitely be minimizing all these cyber threats that we have been hearing and seeing on the news. So thank you for listening and for your attention, and I'll be more than happy to continue the discussion. Please feel free to drop me an email or connect on LinkedIn, and I'll be happy to take any questions if there are any.
Thank you, Öykü. We encourage you to contact Öykü because the area she specializes in is becoming more and more important. I fully agree that security should be integral part of the priorities of the organization, but I was like positively surprised that it's 30% of management boards of organizations that are actively, are interested in what's happening in the security, because as far as I know, most of the organizational management boards, they leave it to IT departments usually, but the challenge is so big today, especially after COVID, especially when we work remotely, it's growing. So we have one question, but I think it's an interesting one. What are the best practices that you can see to improve cybersecurity while working remotely? Is there a best-in-the-class student that you can name as the one to emulate? Can you recommend us something?
Sure. What you say is also so true. We do see actually differences between industries too, right? I think the first one that pops in my mind is financial services industry. Think of any bank. They have been the target for already so long, right? So they are a good source for best practices. Most of the banking system or any financial services organization is pretty good at managing these things. And of course, they have the numbers and they have the resources for this as well. So that's definitely one area that we can turn to if you want to look into for best practices. But from a behavioral perspective, for us as end users, I think something that many organizations are heavily pushing these days becomes very critical. That is the cybersecurity awareness trainings. But I have to say, most of these awareness trainings are either one time off, so you are in front of your laptop, you have a digital platform, you click through your training and you're done. We also now see examples in academic research showing us that is not really very effective in really, staying here and hitting the nail, so to say. So there are now new approaches to figuring out how can we make this knowledge really stick in people's minds? How can we really make sure that when a phishing email comes, that this person will recognize it? Mm-hmm. So I think we still have a lot of room to improve in terms of end user awareness training.
Yes, I understand that it's always in every case, the human element is almost the most critical one and the most difficult one.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Öykü, for today. It's definitely one of the topics that has to be ahead of the list. Thank you for your speech today, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.